Well, I've got to say that the idea of the Institute for the Study of Human Flourishing attracted me immediately when I heard it and met you, and it was the same day. And I've since been running across all kinds of parallels to this. Yale Divinity School is doing work in this same field. Other institutions are doing it, and I really appreciate that as a cause right now. And it's related to what I want to do with you this evening. Now, as Nancy said, this is a last lecture. I did my last lecture in 1987. And it turns out that it wasn't my last lecture, though it might should have been. It just wasn't. But I can tell you what I talked about. I called it My Quest for Connections. You know, in an age where people are making constant distinctions, finer and finer, I wanted to start to see how it goes together, how it fits together. So I had 3 theses, and we had a good time with those. Everything is connected. Everything is in process. And it's all going somewhere. Now, the last one really upset a number of my friends in the natural sciences, so that was the fun part, because we got to talk about whether there is a telos or purpose in the order of things. That was good fun. But now, at 82, this probably is my last lecture, or I'm getting closer to it at least. And I'm very grateful for this tradition. But I've worked hard on this lecture because I wanted it to reflect where my mind really is right now. And Barbara has said that I worked harder on this one than I think any lecture I've ever given, but it's just for my work. I'm just trying to get at it. And so I'm in hopes that it'll be useful to you, but it is really where I'm standing these days. I'm going to talk about 3, I call them cleavages, distinctions that should not be distinctions. And you can hear the echo of my other last lecture in there, but it's I'm working for a little different place in this. And I want to work on these 3 cleavages and why I believe they have to be overcome and for what reason. The reason being this. Have you noticed that the earth is made up of human beings, and all of them seem to be quaking in to one degree or another? We are in a major transition of not only our own cultural history, but of world history. We are really in a shift. And I don't know where it's going, and I'm not going to do a lot of predicting. But it's a shift that is challenging almost every system and every way of life that we have. It's huge. I want to focus on the moral aspect of that because I believe it is absolutely crucial. And therefore, I've come up with my own homemade working definition of what I mean when I hear the word moral or morality. And so you don't have to take it seriously, but you will be wrong. What I really want to let you know is why I want to talk about morality, but I got to start with telling you what I think I'm talking about. Morality is the quality of actions and attitudes that we do in relationship to other people, such that if we're trying to be a moral person, such that the human family will thrive and flourish thereby. That's, I think, when you cut through all the junk that's talked about and the abstractions, it's very concrete, and that's what I want to believe tonight. And I believe that we can become a planetary culture, but only if we learn that very central demand upon us and its prevalence, and it's with everybody for everybody. And I'm not talking about my people against another people. I don't believe in that. And I believe, I'll tell you how many I'm talking about 7.2 billion. And if we don't learn to live together and to work together, we're going to defeat our very lives. How do we deal with that? That's what I'm going to talk about tonight. But in doing so, I say we are in a pretty big mess. And I'm not, do you think I'm making this up? Or I'm hallucinating? Or these are the concoction of an elderly? I read the newspapers and all the documents that are our common parlance these days, and I see it a deep, running, basic issue of our time. How do we create a moral community that is global? Now that is a pipe dream. I know it's big. I know that it's far beyond my ken, but at the same time, if we don't do it, I don't think we're going to make it. And I'm not trying to be overly apocalyptic. I don't like that, and I'm not going to do it. However, I do love a poem by W.B. Yeats, wonderful Irish poet, who wrote in 1919, just at the end of the First World War, an amazing poem called The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center will not hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-stem tide is loosed. And everywhere the sounds of innocence are drowned. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now, you would think he wrote that today. Very powerful poem. That's the first stanza. And when I read that poem the first time, it knocked me over, because he was seeing the kind of potential chaos that we can form and deform in our lives today. And we've got to pay attention to this and worry with it. And I know a lot of people are, and I hope all of you are. I'm not trying to preach it. I'm just trying to say this is how my lecture has come about. I want to go in there and look at it. So here's what I've come up with. I believe there are, and this is just my work. It's stuff I've done, but it's my last lecture. Give me a break. So I call them the three cleavages. And by cleavage, I mean three things that are separated that shouldn't be separated. They've been separated for eons. And I believe that when they come together, we are forming our way toward a moral universe. I really do believe that. Now, I'm going to do an extra thing along the way, because I've negotiated with my bosses, and they have asked me to name 3 virtues from a list of virtues that they're working on in the Institute. And they want me to name those 3 virtues, and I'm going to do it, but they're embedded in the text of what I have to say, right? And I'll bring them up when that's appropriate. How's that work? All right. I'm going to deal with the first cleavage. I'm starting from the big picture and going down to a much smaller picture. But I'm going to start with this. I called it, for want of a better term, my cosmic dimension. The universe that I share with you and we all inhabit, and we're trying to understand better as we live. And that cosmic reach is very large. But, well, infinite probably, but at the same time, I want to talk about it in this way. I want to talk about it in terms of one split off. And it's the split, of all things, highly abstract, between permanence and change. Do you know that's been a battle since well before Socrates? You know? Heraclitus and Parmenides were in opposition long ago, and one was advocating permanence and the other advocating change, and off they went into the sunset and created a problem that's been going on ever since. That's called philosophy. Now, when I got hold of this problem and what it looks like on the ground, I began to shape much of my study around that. And around this very abstract concept. Is reality fixed, stable and static, or is it changing and processive and dynamic? I believe the answer is yes. And I believe that is what I mean by synergy, the coming together of distinct elements in a way that enhances all that the elements provide us. That's what I'm going to try to do. And I'm going to start with a story. This story goes back to my graduate school days. I was at Vanderbilt Divinity School starting graduate studies, and I took a course. It was a course I'd never heard of this field before. It was fascinating. It was called process theology. I didn't know what it was about. I knew how to spell it, but I didn't know what it was about. And so I went into my classes, and it was based on the work of Alfred North Whitehead and some theologians who had come out of that. And I'm going to just cut to the chase. What it really said is, God is a part of a changing universe, or there is no God, in effect. God is not a static and fixed deity at all. God is process itself. Well, that kind of intrigued me. I was young and I came out of a highly evangelical background, but I thought, So I went home at spring break to visit my mom, and she said at breakfast one morning, "What are you studying?" And so I told her about process theology. Now, my mother was a very devout, very traditional woman, and she was very mild-mannered. She didn't yell. I've seldom ever heard her yell at anybody about anything. And she stood at the table, slammed her hand down and said, "No! God does not change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever." Verse out of Hebrews. And I was a dutiful son, so I said, "Yes, ma'am." But at the same time, it kicked off a whole process about process. And I began to study it as a phenomenon. And over the years, I've kept going back to it. You see, my mother is still back there where the universe is really solid, fixed, and stable, and God is just the emblematic name for that whole understanding. Know that you got to get to something changeless to ground change. But all the time, modernity's been happening. Have you noticed? And as modernity happened, change started being more and more central. For example, we now contend with this proposition: is the universe expanding? We're being told that it's not only expanding, it's expanding faster. And it's been expanding for about 14 or 15 billion years, give or take, however you argue it. Or, do you know, Democritus and Lucretius taught that we've got to the basis because we've gotten down to atoms. See, everybody thinks atoms are a modern idea. Nope. Very ancient. And they were trying to get down to the thing that doesn't change, the kernel. But you know what we did? We broke atoms open. And when you break them open, they're very busy. You know? You work with soil, as Tom here does, and it's full of microbes and things are happening all the time. The Earth's crust, when they first discovered this in geology, they couldn't believe that the Earth's crust changed and that whole continents could move from one place to another. Now it's slow, we hope, but it happens. And then when you get, and this is where it exploded for religion, didn't it? It was first 1859. And Brother Charlie Darwin published a book, The Origin of Species. A few years later, in 1872, he published The Descent of Man. And I mean, that really upset some troops. And it still does. It's been there a long time. But what's it about? It's about all life changes. The forms of life change. They move through their own history. And then along comes Sigmund Freud and said, and people too change within their lifespan. And he was the originator of the idea of developmental psychology. He didn't build it up, but he was the first daddy of it. Everything is moving and changing and shifting. Now, that's so commonplace today, and so many of us believe that and live our lives accordingly that we don't take stock of it very much. But it does raise a question, particularly at the moral dimension of our thinking. It raises a question, where do you stand to make moral judgments? Is there any terra firma? Is there any place that you can locate yourself? Because you see, morality is a kind of continuity, if you'll think about it. You make decisions, you live with consequences, make further decisions in relation to consequences, and have more consequences, and you never can get over it. And if you're going to be a moral person, remember my definition, if you're going to be a moral person, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have a place sufficiently stabilized to do that in the midst of all the flux and change of life. Yeah, I'm not going back to the old idea of permanence. I think we're in a dynamic universe. I believe that with all my heart. But I believe the dynamism includes continuity, it includes stability, and I believe in the moral universe, it's right here. It's in humanity. I don't believe nature has moral issues. It just does what it does. The moral question is our question. The moral question, and learning to stand there, is a human question that we must answer and cope with and deal with every day. And that is not easy. You've got to feel for that. It is not easy to do, but that's the challenge, that we have to live moral lives by finding a ballast, finding a kind of continuity by which we can live consistently, more or less. It's not a foolish consistency that the hobgoblin of little minds. I'm not going there, but Emerson's dead. But what I'm really getting at is that's our job, to maintain a continuity within the flux and flow of time and space. Isn't that amazing thing we're called to? And you know, when I go there, I have some language. This is language in the field of ethics. It has to do with the word character for me. You know, we at this university help people build careers, but we don't help them build character. We're not very good at that. And it's because it is difficult. And I think, Nancy, you have a tremendous job on your hands to try to bring the issues of character that allows us to live in a world full of flux and shifting change, and at the same time have sufficient stability that we can act, and you can anticipate that my acts will be such that you can act in response in a way that we can flourish. That's it. It's simple, but it's not easy. And therefore, I get into this idea, and it drives me nuts sometimes, because I study what is it to help nurture character, help nurture kind of a moral sensitivity. And a word that often comes up in relationship to that is a very old and classic word, virtue. Right? What do you think a virtue is? You ever thought about that? I've struggled with it, and I finally said virtue doesn't work in common parlance, anymore. It's a great word. It's got a great history, but most people don't use it very much. Have you heard the word this week? They just don't get it. That much. Well, I've said, what is it? It's qualities of well-being. That's my own definition, so it's eternally true. But that I live moving into qualities that bring about well-being, both for myself and other people. And when I live those qualities, I'm living what classically was known as the virtues. That's the way I use the language. And so I'm going to introduce the first of my virtues. I told you I would. The first of my virtues is perseverance. Isn't that an odd virtue to choose? But it is a powerful virtue that relates to the very point I'm making. It relates to the very point I'm making because as you move through with continuity, you have to persist in the movement. You have to live that way, not just do it once in a while, but it's a way you live. And those virtues, such as perseverance, are by no means easy. Now, it's problematic. I'm going to show you how problematic it is. A serial killer can persevere. So you take this virtue in isolation from a family of virtues and it doesn't work. You've got to be persevering in terms of the ongoing nurturing of your own moral character in the world with other people. You do this concretely with other people. You don't go take seminars in ethics. You do it in a living, vital setting. Does that make sense? That's what I think about it these days. And so when I was thinking about perseverance, I said, okay, here's a virtue that's very close to that cleavage I'm trying to overcome. Very close to that cleavage, because our task is to stay with it, right? I like a passage. It's in the Christian New Testament. I just love this. Do not grow weary of well-doing. Mm-hmm. You know? And what that is saying is persevere. And I think all traditions talk about that perseverance, staying with it, staying on cue. That is critical in the terms of how character gets lived out, sustained over time. We don't just build character and suck our thumbs. We build character by living out character in the way we behave with each other. And it's hard work. I'm not a master of it. Do you understand that? I'm just pointing it out because I'd rather you have to do it than me. But we all got to do it, haven't we? Yeah. That's my first cleavage. I believe that this split between permanence and change is not adequate to our needs. We live in a world full of flux, looking constantly toward the continuities, toward the sustainabilities. And I've seen this in the natural sciences. I'm not going to go into that simply because of our time, but I want you to know that I believe we can work on that. I like that. Let me give you a second cleavage, and this is another dimension. This is what I call the cultural dimension. And this is a cleavage most of us know more about because it's closer to home. We all live in a culture whether we like it or not. And some of my students had difficulty along through the years learning that they had a culture. No, I have reality. Other people have cultures, you know. And so, no, we're all anchored in a culture, and we've got to learn to live that culture and honor the culture, really, and challenge the culture. All that is very tough stuff. But I think at the heart of our culture problem is a split. And that split was between the secular and the sacred. I think it is a false split. I think it's been going on for about 300 years, and it ain't adequate. It also isn't adequate. But I'm going to read you my definition of this problematic. I love it because I stole it from Albert Outler, who is a church historian. He's Methodist, but he's okay. Early Christians were stuck with their conviction that God is not absent anywhere. For them, the whole creation is sacred through and through because of God's providence. That's the fixed point. And yet also secular throughout because of human responsibilities. From this laudable coherence of the sacred and the secular, there then developed a widespread and fatal misconstruction. The dominance of the secular order by the sacred. And you can see that right through the Middle Ages. Even when Galileo knew it early. That is a powerful statement to me. And this is the fatal construction. This issue was hopelessly then corrupted when both sides agreed that what was secular and what was sacred, and they do not bond at all. And he says then, and then we fought over the dividing line, and that false disjunction has plagued us ever since. So I want to get back to that, but I want to get back to it without, how am I going to say this? I'm not trying to be pious. I'm as critical of religion as any of you could be all the time. But I'm kind of a critical insider. You know, I disrupt. And my wife's a downright outlaw. But we work with that, because I think what has happened, we have allowed the formal religions of the world, I'm not dealing with any one of them, I'm dealing with the phenomenon. The formal religions of the world have become custodians of the sacred. And in the process, they house it, control it, and reduce it very often to their set of dogmas, their set of history. And that's not adequate anymore. It may have been historically necessary and adequate at one point. It's not anymore. But that doesn't mean that what it was custodian of is irrelevant. Because I believe, with my favorite theologian, Paul Tillich, he said, the sacred and the secular are not separate. They interfuse each other. Isn't that interesting? And therefore we have to learn about that. Here's my premise. We're in trouble, and we're highly secularized. Does that say anything to you? Now you're saying, well, you can't blame it on our secularization. That's not right. But I am going to blame it on that, because I can leave afterward. But what I really deeply believe about this is that our sacrality has become lost in a secular flatness, secular superficiality. Have you ever heard so much trivia and superficiality? For example, we once in a while, it's not often, we once in a while will want to watch something on TV. Have you ever tried to find a program that had depth and stimulation an evening of TV? And therefore we just gave up. You know, we say, well, you can't get there. Why? We have trivialized and made superficial so much of it that one of my recent authors, Nicholas Carr, has written a book called The Shallows. And it is really about technology. That because we can go so fast, communicate so far, we have trivialized communication deeply and profoundly. So profoundly that the poet David White has said it brilliantly and beautiful. David White is a Welsh poet that Barbara's going to be studying with this summer in England, and I'm just amazed at his work. Listen to this. This is not the age of information. This is not the age of information. Forget the news and the radio and the blurred screen. This is the time of loaves and fishes. People are hungry, and one good word is bread for 1,000. Now don't get lost in the one good word and say, which one is it? That's wrong. What it's saying is a word that really conveys and really communicates and really brings people into some coordination with each other. That's the good word. And there, we're not doing that. We are just jabbering. In fact, I was worried about saying this in this lecture. Am I jabbering? You don't want to do that. Don't do that. So you dig around and try to find something other than that. And I believe it has even come home more with Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. Have you read that book? And by the way, he celebrates that it's gone flat. He calls himself a flattist. You know, the world's gone flat, and it's primarily economic preoccupations that bring you there. And so he takes up the image of that Carr has and makes it and applauds it. Goodness, something has to happen. So I want to work with a metaphor. A metaphor that brings the sacred back into play. And that metaphor is depth. That's all it is. It's not even an unusual metaphor. But depth is a very powerful and interesting thing, isn't it? If you think about it, if you meditate on it a while. Yeah. We sometimes will say to someone, of someone, they're very deep. You know? And we really mean they say words I don't understand or things like that. But you know, that they go places that we don't commonly go. So I've worked on the issue of depth as a metaphor for what I mean by the sacred. The sacred is that rests powerfully within us, and it's not, you don't have to go to church to see it or feel it. It is that which comes up when you become astonished at the world you live in. You become overwhelmed by simply another human being. You know, I had a friend a while back who said when they had their first baby, he kept counting toes and fingers, and he just said, they've got real fingers. I mean, fingers you can bend and do all kinds of things with. And I saw him astonished. Just like my daughter sitting here. We had a cat. Guinevere was a strange cat. And she became illegally impregnated by a Persian cat down the street. And she was heavy with kitten. You remember that? And so on a given Sunday morning, the water broke, and I had to go to Oklahoma City to speak, and the whole family stayed there to watch these kittens come in. Now, Katrina, during the process of gestation, had been very interested in learning more about feline, gestation. Well, what did I know? So I went to a local veterinarian, and he gave me a little booklet, and I gave it to her, and she memorized the thing, and she'd say, and look at the cats. And we did this for several weeks. When Guinevere's water broke on Sunday morning, I left. That's how courageous I am. And then when I came back from my assignment in the city, they were all in the closet because that's where she had chosen her hour. And they were all watching it. And her brother was trying to keep from throwing up. And she was just engaged with that kitten coming to birth. And Guinevere had 3 of them. And Katrina would just walk around with this book, go in and watch them for 3 or 4 days. I just thought, okay, she'll get over this. But she was really excited. Cats have baby kittens, and they become cats also. And at 9 years of age, that was electric for this child, right? And so about the 3rd or 4th day, she came in and said, Daddy, when I grow up, I could have a baby, couldn't I? I said, yes. She said, but it would never be a cat, right? And she was very reassured when I said that. And she said, I think I'll do it. Except, do I have to eat the little bag they come in? But what just amazed and thrilled me was she was in the zone of the sacred, folk. She was in the zone of the sacred. She knew the facts. She had read the books. But it was still astonishing and amazing. And if we get so isolated from the depth of our encounter with the world that we can't feel the sacrality of that, the insight, the mystery of it, we're in trouble. That's depth. That's what I mean by it. In the very word sacred, I think depth. I think give things a thickness. And it's all, by the way, when you get into this region, you're all into metaphors and symbols. Don't worry about it. Work with them. Wake up. It's a way of understanding that the universe is there, but it's there as almost a claim on us. And we're there. Have you ever looked at another person and realize they are another person. It's so strange, you know? And they keep showing up. Barbara wakes up some mornings and says, "You still there?" And we keep doing those things. But what I'm getting at is that the sacred is there in our very lives. And in the book I've written that's out there is, I've worked on that pretty hard. I think we've got to recover the sacred without covering over in such organized piety that we can't keep the throb of it going. That's my first point. I've got a second. And the second point is depth itself. Do you have an interior life? How do we nurture that? I had a colleague here in psychology about back in the 70s, and he challenged students and got about 12 takers. He challenged students to spend an afternoon all by themselves with no books, no radio. They didn't have cell phones in those days, and just spend half a day with yourself. He said 4 hours is plenty. Out of the 12 who did it, only 3 completed it, and it wasn't fun for them. They completed it only because it helped their grade, but they just said they couldn't do it. How much time do you spend with your own inner life? Now, I want to tell you, here's a man who taught me a great deal about that. I remember one day you walked into the little place where we always talked, and you said, "Tom, we need to talk about inwardness, the interior life." And we've done it ever since in one way or another. That's part of what I mean by depth. I was in... For my 60th birthday, Barbara sent me to a psychiatrist named Robert Johnson. But she sent me up to northern Canada, and I was going to spend a week with him. We were going to have fun. And about 20 other people there. And Robert Johnson's a wonderful Jungian analyst. And it was just a wonderful party. And he's such a gentle man. I loved him. And one day, someone said, "What are you writing now?" He said, "I've quit." "Why did you quit?" He said, "I'm repeating myself." And then they said, "Well, what are you going to do now?" He said, "I'm going to become a theologian." And all of us, I even turned around and said, What? And he says, everybody thinks the idea of God is up and out there. Not at all. The idea of God is down and within. I'm always messing up that way. God is down and in. See, and I've been working on that idea. I have trouble and a lot of arguments, John. Okay.
Be quick to help him.
Okay. I don't help that much. Well, but whatever we mean by the sacred, you've got to go deep to begin to get it. And you can't live in the surface stuff, this trappings of language that is so trivialized that it drives me crazy. But you've got to be willing to go deep enough to touch the intonations of your being. And that is where I believe the term depth touches what I mean by the sacred. It is an engagement at that depth. And I think it is all right for us to talk about that. And I've had many experiences out of depth moments. And I don't need to bore you with them because you've had them too. Just pay attention to them. And those moments are worth the rest of our lives. And therefore the secular is not my enemy. I'm as secular as anybody in this room. I don't decry being a secular human being. But the sacred is not thereby diminished or taken away. Now let me give you another virtue. This is a real different one. The virtue of self-regulation. By the way, that comes right out of inwardness. You can't get it any other way. You have to develop an inner life to get in charge of yourself, and it takes a lifetime. I'm 82 years old, and I'm working on it. And I mean that seriously, that I'm working on what it means to be a human being constantly in relationship to other human beings, and how that works out in such a way that my own sense of fullness and wholeness is intact. I don't know how else to say it. And I think self-regulation, I like it. I think my grandmother started teaching me about self-regulation. And because every time as an adolescent, we lived with him during a couple of years, every time as an adolescent, I would, blow my candle and head off in some direction. She'd say, "Gather yourself." Isn't that a great phrase? I don't know where she came up with it, but it hit me between the eyes every time. Gather, and I tried. I don't know whether I did it. But it's like the old Quaker statement. They'll say, "Center down." Find the locus of your gravity in life and be willing to stay there for a while. There's nothing wrong with that. Let's do it. And therefore, I believe that the sacred-secular split with an endless degeneration of the sacred element has got to stop, and we have to recover it without thinking we've got to put a halo on and go all pious. No. It's a way of living with depth. It's a way of living in such a way that we don't simply devolve into the shallows. Does that make sense to you? I don't mean you agree with it. It makes sense. Think about that. We've got to work on it, folk. And now my last one. You like this part. My last one is the personal dimension. The personal dimension has a cleavage in it these days. It's been around a long time. It bothers me. And that cleavage is between the self and the other. Now, I didn't invent this at all. It's in the drinking water. I started studying it when I read the works of Martin Buber and Levinas and started seeing that there's something fundamentally wrong in modernity, although we have made great strides. I think the coming to be of individuality as a concept. Some trace it to the Renaissance, others trace it to early modernity. I don't care. It's that we are full astride of it right now. But there is a real problem here that is twofold. We are stretched between mass culture on the one hand and hyper-individualism on the other. And and by the way, the same person can be in both and not know it. Highly individualistic, just like everybody else. And it's a dangerous place to be. And I believe mass culture creates sheep. I think Nietzsche was right when he said that, we have this herd instinct in ethics especially. We can fall into that. And therefore mass culture is problematic. I live in mass culture. You can't help it today if you wake up and look out the door. But you don't have to succumb to its lure. You don't have to go there. You just have to know it, and you have to live in relationship to it. You can't live without it. It's everywhere. But the other side of it's the one I want to focus on right now. Individualism. Wow. Yeah. I had a student, this is back in the 80s. He was a long, lean guy who sat on the front row of a class of about 400 over here at Dale Hall, and he always looked at the ceiling during the entire class, and he aced everything. Real bright cookie, and but we never talked or anything. I depend on students to come to me if they want to. If they don't want to, I'll say, have a good day. But he wanted to come to my office after class one day, had a big book under his arm. And I said, sure, come on. And we went up to my office, and as we walked, we just chatted and so forth. Got into the office, I sat down, and he said, have you ever heard of Ayn Rand? I said, yes, I've heard of her. So he pulled out Atlas Shrugged. He said, have you read this book? I said, yes, I read it. He said, what do you think of Ayn Rand? I said, well, she's taken a half-truth and made it the whole truth, so she's a half-wit. Because she's forgotten, she's forgotten the bond between self and other. That is primary. Well, he lit in to a highly volatile speech in the ken of old rugged individualism, you know. And he talked about John Galt and the fountainhead, and you got to become the master, and da-da-da-da-da. Went on. And in the middle of it, I said, could you tell me in what year you gave birth to yourself? And he just stopped and stared at me as though I were nuts and went on. It didn't affect him at all. And so a little bit later, he was raving. And so he'd read a bunch of junk. And he was really smart. I mean, he had it all laced together. It's really fine. And then, later it came up, I said, in what year did you invent the English language? That would be a good one. I'd like to know that. And he said, why do you keep asking me these dumb questions? And I said, because you are so dependent, you're a joke. How many people do you depend on right now to be standing here speaking the English language and wearing clothes and in an office built by who? You don't know. See? And we wound up having a really good talk. We talked several times on the nature of interdependence, what it looks like, how it works. But I believe we become persons only interpersonally. You know, I am so dependent on so many people for the shape of my life, from birth to this day. And that does not mean that I have no self. I may not have one, but not in that respect. Because individuality is very important, but it's an emergent property in the context of interpersonal life. That's all it is. And once you get that in your thick head, you begin to get at the heart of what morality is all about. Morality is really about understanding that truth. I'm only ever genuinely a person when I'm with other persons. And even if you don't have other persons, we have a tendency to manufacture them. For example, how many of you saw the movie Castaway? Let's go back to that movie. His plane crashes over the Pacific, and he, by some miracle of weather and wave, made it to an island. It was a totally isolated place. And he was there. Tom Hanks played the part. And all he had on him was a picture of his fiancée, the top of a pocket watch. He put it in the cave where he was staying, and he looked at it every day, but it every day got a little more faded, until her countenance was no longer available to him. Then one day he's walking. By this time he's been there a long time, and he's walking along the beach, and he sees in a little eddy a soccer ball. He picks the soccer ball up, and it has one word written on it: Wilson. And so Wilson becomes his bosom companion. Now, most of us might be inclined to say, well, he went over the edge right there. You know, he's having a relationship with a volleyball. But if you understood the context, he's totally alone, but we can't tolerate that. We will generate another. We will create another where there is none. Read some stories about people in solitary confinement for a long time, and you'll hear about it, that we need the other. We need the presence of the other. Steve McQueen, and what was that French movie where it's the words...
Papillon.
Papillon.
It's not actually a French movie.
Okay, it's a movie set in France. Okay, sorry about that, Professor. But what that movie showed me, among other things, is Steve McQueen is in solitary confinement for about 6 months. And they finally let him stick his head out of a little portal in his booth. There were other booths. And when he looked to the side and saw another human being, he said, "How do I look? Give me the mirror. Let me see that, am I really here?" That is so elemental and so fundamental to us that we must overcome that cleavage at all cost and understand individuality as nurtured within sociality, and that we belong to each other. And we belong so deeply that morality should be inherent in it, all the way down to our closest and our most distant relations. Wow. I believe in that. I believe it's difficult. I believe we must live it. And I earnestly desire that. And therefore, I'm beginning to think, folk, that we live in an age where we must relearn who we are. Not everybody. I think there's some people doing wonderful work on themselves and with each other for the future. But we've got to do that. Because modernity has done many marvelous things for us and also trapped us. I want to go back, to finish this up, I want to go back to a poet, an 18th century poet, wonderful poet, William Wordsworth. And Wordsworth is living out the edge of the Industrial Revolution. He can see it coming to England. And it troubles him deeply, as it did another of the poets of that time, William Blake. But they were troubled over this whole business of the mechanistic world taking over. One of my favorites of his is, "The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending we lay waste our powers. Little there is in nature that is ours. We give ourselves away, a sordid boon. This sea that lifts her bosom to the moon, these winds that shall be howling at all hours and are uplifted now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn, that I might, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn." He goes way back to ancient nature-centered Olympian religion and gets images. Why? He believes that we've lost our depth. We've lost our place in the relational world. And we've got to go back there. And we go back there when we get into relationship with nature itself. And that's what the whole poem's about. We're in a mess. Go back and get to the elements and let them teach you something new. And they will teach you the sacred. Because notice what he goes for. He goes for the sacred. Now it's an ancient, obscure religion. And he said, that it's an image for him, isn't it? It helps him to say what he fears most in the mechanistic age, that flatness. He doesn't want that. He wants the thickness. Now, in light of what I've said, and I haven't unloaded the full wagon load on you. I wanted to say some things, and I think I've told my truth, but I'm not an optimist. I'm not a pessimist. Those, by the way, are secular terms that arose with the rise of progressivism. The word optimist came right out of the progressivist movement. If you're an optimist, everything's going to be hunky-dory. Well, I'm not that. But I do live in hope. And I live in hope enough to act and to keep on acting. And I'm seeing more and more people take this up. Hope is not simply whistling in the dark. It has to be active. But I want to tell you something. Hope is fragile. Hope is delicate. It perseveres, but it's delicate. I like Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that would abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've seen it in the darkest land and on the strangest sea, but never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Now, Emily got hold of stuff, and comes in the back door. And you'll notice I have quoted a number of poems. Poets are ahead of their time. Do you know that? They're foreseeing what the rest of us stumble over later. And therefore, I think listening to the voice of the poet can be, and we've talked about that, can be a tremendous resource in understanding our own times, in understanding ways through those times. And what Dickinson's poem did for me is it is a powerful way of saying hope is a delicate thing, but it's persistent. And I refuse to have an apocalyptic fit and run off as though the end had already come. That's crazy. We've got to find the folk who have the capacity to rebond the cleavages and rebond them in good faith. And it doesn't mean you have to do it with the whole world. You do it for your next door neighbor, your friend down the street, your mate, whoever. Do it. And I believe that will do more to help the plight we're in today. Now, I just looked up. It's 7 o'clock. What do you want to do? Or what do you want me to do? Sit down and shut up?
What do you want to do?
Well, I like to talk with people. And I like them to talk back at me and straighten me out. Do we have a little bit of time to do that?
Yeah, let's make a deal.
Okay?
Let's make a deal. We got to do a survey first,
Oh, well, do that.
and then we will have Q&A. How about that?
Oh, that's delicious, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking